I'm kidding. They're locked in their cells. All right, folks. Where we're standing now is one of the most infamous places in the country for two very good reasons. But before I actually get into where we're talking, where we're standing now, we're going to go back and I'm going to talk a little bit more about where we've just left. We can see it a little bit better from here. So, if you look back down Water Lane, where we just walked, on the right-hand side, you'll see there's a large tower. That is called the Bell Tower. Built through the reign of King Richard I, the Lionheart. It derives its name, as you might imagine, from that small white belfry you can see up there at the top. And it still contains one of the oldest surviving curfew bells in London. When sounding an alarm, that was a signal for us to drop the portcullises, close all the gates and doors, and man these battlements for defence. It is still sounded at 16:45 every day to notify all yeoman warders that any children still left on site can be legally beheaded. So kids, if you hear the bell and you're on the inside, run. Especially you. The bell tower itself is the oldest and the strongest of the 13 guard towers that stand on this inner defensive wall. Stands on a solid block of masonry about 30 feet deep, and it consists of two separate circular prison chambers stacked one above the other. In this case, though, they're not connected by a spiral staircase. That's just because the lower chamber was built first. It has had some very important guests invited to stay there. Princess Elizabeth was imprisoned there by her half-sister, Mary Tudor, also known as... Don't mention that woman here. Also known as Bloody Mary, of course. Now, they were both daughters of King Henry VIII. Eventually, though, Mary ascends to the throne, as she's absolutely convinced that her sister, Elizabeth, is somehow involved in a plot. Now, this was the Sir Thomas Wyatt plot, aimed at preventing Mary from marrying Philip of Spain and ultimately removing her from the throne. Now, Elizabeth was incredibly intelligent. Her followers and supporters, they were unshakably loyal, and nobody implicated her in that plot. Miraculously, after about 6 weeks, although she is banished to Woodstock, she survives. She leaves the Tower of London with her head still physically connected to her body. No mean feat. She only ever returns back here once more in her lifetime, 4 years later, 1558, to prepare for her own coronation as Queen Elizabeth I of England. And she goes on to rule for almost 45 glorious years. Now, by far the shortest stay down there was by a man called James Scott. Now, he's also known as the Duke of Monmouth, and he was the eldest of King Charles II's 13 illegitimate children. That's more than I've got. I'm joking, but I've got less than half that figure. When Charles dies, though, he has no legitimate son and heir. So actually, it's his brother that is appointed as the new king. He is also called James, and he is crowned King James II. But now, James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, he is absolutely adamant that his mother was at one time married to King Charles. Now, this is alleged to have been during a time that Charles is in exile in France, keeping out the way of a man called Oliver Cromwell. A man who dared to call England a republic! Sorry, it's still very upsetting. Now, we dealt with that nonsense in 1660 and we returned England to its rightful glory with a monarch at our heads. However, if what was being said about him was true, it would have made him legitimate and it would have given him a rightful claim to the throne. Now, he was both popular and powerful. So powerful and so popular, he actually manages to raise an army and he directly challenges the king in battle. Now, this battle becomes the last full-scale land battle that ever takes place on English soil. It occurs in the evening of the 6th of July, 1685, down in the West Country, be forever known as the Battle of Sedgemoor. Unfortunately, though, for James Scott and his poorly equipped, poorly trained pitchfork army, of course, he was defeated. Now, although James himself manages to escape the battlefield, he was tried and he was sentenced to death in his absence. About a week later, though, he was found hiding in a forest down near a place called Ringwood. He was arrested, brought back up here, locked up down there in the lower chamber under sentence of death. And he was held there for just 2 days before he's taken up there to Tower Hill and beheaded in what becomes arguably the bloodiest execution the Tower ever sees. Now, the execution on that day, he was a 6'5" giant of a man called Jack Ketch. Now, Jack Ketch was by trade a butcher. He was also a part-time executioner at Tower of London, and he loved a drink. On that particular day, he manages to combine all three skills. And yes, for clarification, drinking within the United Kingdom is classified as a skill. The only place that changes is in Scotland, and there we classify it as an art. Now, it takes Jack Ketch no less than 5 strokes of the axe to try and sever the head from the body. Even then, it isn't done, and he has to rely on his butchering skills. Kneeling down beside his victim, taking a firm grasp of what was left of that battered and brutalised head, he removes his butcher's knife from his belt, and slowly he begins to cut, hack, slice, and saw the last pieces of muscle, bone, flesh, sinew, tissue, skin, gristle, cut. What? Who owns this one? It's broken. We know you're broken. All the very best people are broken. Until eventually that head comes clear. Now, there's more to the story though, because in those days it was customary for royalty and nobility to have their portraits painted at regular intervals as a good record. Now, when James II ascends to the throne, James Scott, just like his father, he flees into exile. Shortly after he's been beheaded, somebody realised that while he's in exile, no portrait has been painted. Oh dear. There is, of course, only one sensible solution. A yeoman warder is immediately dispatched down to London Bridge to fetch back his head. The royal surgeon is called for to stitch the head back onto the body. With the Duke dressed in fine clothes, laid out upon a couch with a slightly unfashionably high collar, the artist was given just 24 hours to complete that painting. Now, that painting is owned by the National Portrait Gallery. It's not always on display though, because it's a bit rubbish. He was given 1 day to paint a dead guy. He was not doing his best work, was he? Nonetheless, it is on display sometimes. Failing that, you can always ask our very good close personal friend Google. They will show you the image of James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth. At least now when you see that portrait, you'll understand why he's got a somewhat vacant look on his face. Right, I mentioned it when we got here, one of the most infamous places in the country for 2 very good reasons. Behind you is the infamous Bloody Tower. I'll tell you all about that in a little while. But behind me is the equally infamous Traitor's Gate, and this is where we'll start. So, Traitor's Gate itself is actually built on the orders of King Edward I, and that was simply because he wanted a safer and a more useful entrance here into the Tower of London, and rather than using the packed, narrow, dirty, stinking streets of London, where convoys could be attacked, stores stolen, or even prisoners set free, he decides that he's going to use the River Thames as a highway. So high tide, boats can pass through this gate, and they can unload their cargoes in safety. Therefore, this gate was originally known as the Watergate. What he also realises, though, by having this opening here in the outer walls, he has significantly weakened the defences of the fortress. So he orders that a defensive tower be built above the gate to defend it. It's called St Thomas's Tower. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the medieval palace, but it's named after St Thomas of Becket. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was brutally murdered on the steps of Canterbury Cathedral on the orders of Edward's great-grandfather, King Henry II, in 1170. But when did it actually become known as Traitor's Gate? Well, like I told you earlier, it was known as the Watergate, and because of its practical application, the name was changed from the Watergate to Trader's Gate. Then, of course, only a small play on words to go from Trader's Gate to Traitor's Gate. Now, that happens during the Tudor period because of the increasingly large numbers of treacherous prisoners who start to enter this mighty fortress through that grim gate. Among them, 3 queens of England, Queen Anne Boleyn, Queen Catherine Howard, and Queen Jane Grey, the young 16 or 17-year-old uncrowned queen of just 9 days. High dignitaries of the church, they are no exception. Archbishop Cranmer, Bishops Latimer and Ridley, they are all in prison here during the reign of Queen Mary Tudor. Those 3 deeply religious and pious men, they were later taken to the end of Broad Street in Oxford, and they were burned alive. In the 5 years that Queen Mary Tudor was in charge, 312 people were officially recorded to have died as heretics. Almost 300 of those were burned alive. Many historians describe this as the fires of faith, and to this day it remains one of the most intense periods of religious persecution in English history. And quite rightly, it earns her nickname, Bloody Mary. Right, folks, that's just over 20 minutes of doom and gloom. Who's up for a story with a happy ending? Yeah, should have gone somewhere else then. Right, folks, behind us is the Bloody Tower, originally known as the Garden Tower. It used to overlook the Lieutenant's Garden, sits on the other side of this inner valley wall. The name was changed to the Bloody Tower during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, as a memorial to many of the dark deeds that are alleged to have happened inside those walls. Many of them, they were written about by a man called Shakespeare. And when Shakespeare writes about the Garden Tower, he refers to it as the Tower of Blood. And there were many dark deeds. The slow poisoning to death of Sir Thomas Overbury by a jealous lady. The imprisonment on 3 separate occasions of Sir Walter Raleigh before he was eventually executed in 1618 down at the Old Palace Yard, Westminster, for his part in the Arbella Stuart plot to overthrow King James. But by far, the darkest of all of those alleged deeds, of course, is the murder of the 2 boy princes in 1485. How old are you, young person?
20.
I'm here till 5:30. You take your time.
9.
Correct. Well done. How old are you, youngster? Nope. You, as if you're young. Come on. You look 40 as it is. How old are you, young person? How old? That doesn't work. Say 12. Yeah, you should really know your age after 12 years, shouldn't you? Any loving uncles? Not sure if you got an uncle, just not sure if he loves you. Keep your eye on them. So, on the death of their father, King Edward IV, the young Prince Edward and his younger brother, Richard the Duke of York, they were 12 and 9 years old respectively. And they were brought here to the Tower for protection by their loving uncle, Richard the Duke of Gloucester, Lord Protector of England. Now, the problem was that soon after they arrived here, their loving uncle, Richard the Duke of Gloucester, Lord Protector of England, he declares that they are illegitimate. And their loving uncle, Richard Duke of Gloucester, Lord Protector of England, suddenly becomes King Richard III. After that, those boys, they disappear, and they are never seen alive again. Sorry. 2 years later, 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, King Richard III was slain. He was killed during the battle. Sometime after that, it is alleged that a man comes forward by the name of Sir James Tyrrell, and he admits to murdering by smothering and suffocating the boys as they slept up there in the upper chamber of Bloody Tower. And you can see their windows right at the top. After which time, their lifeless bodies, they are wrapped into their bedding, they are bundled down a stairwell here, and they are hidden beneath rubble in the basement of the Wakefield Tower. Sometime later, those boys are moved again to a secret location by an unnamed priest. Those boys are not located for 191 years. It was not until the reign of King Charles II in 1674, during conservation work taking place on the south side of the White Tower, the conservators discover a large chest behind a false wall under a staircase. Excited, they rip the lid open, expecting that they're going to find gold and jewels. What they actually find are the bones of 2 young boys. Experts of the day, they declare they are indeed the missing princes, and eventually, on the orders of the king, about 4 years later, they are moved to Westminster Abbey and they are re-interned in a place called Innocents Corner, which is named in their honour. And both those boys, whoever they are, they still lie there to this very day. The moral of this story, you are never safe, even at home, in your own bed, amongst your own loved ones. Sleep well. Good. In 2012, folks, we finally managed to locate, uncover, and genetically prove the remains of King Richard III. And he was finally discovered under the social services car park in Leicester. Now, whether you believe that he is responsible for the murder of the 2 boy princes or not, put that to one side. But it is important for us to recognise he was only our 2nd monarch in history and the 1st in over 400 years to die at the head of his army in battle. And he has now been re-interned in Leicester Cathedral. Right, folks, come here, get right through the centre. I'll take you through to the inner ward. Come this way, folks.